and Femi, okay. Welcome to the stream. Russian activist Alexei Navalny is known globally as an opposition politician. Inside Russia, though, he's known as a famous investigative journalist. Right now, he is lying in a hospital bed in Germany in a medically induced coma, apparently after being poisoned. That fact is, or that situation is being discussed widely. But what we want to discuss on the stream today is Russian opposition finished? Where to next? YouTubers, I know that you have a take on that. You can jump into our live comment chat and you too can be in the stream. I'm going to say hello to the guests. The guests will introduce themselves to you. Alexis, nice to have you. Tell everybody who you are.
Hi, I'm Alexis Lerner. I'm a PhD in political science, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Western University in Canada. I study authoritarianism and protest in Russia.
Good to have you, Alexis. And Brian, introduce yourself to our international audience.
Hi, my name is Brian MacDonald. I'm the head of the Russia desk at RT.com. RT is Russia's international broadcaster, but I work on the online section only, not the television. So you can read all about it at RT.com.
All right, excellent. All right, so Brian, bearing in mind your sources that you have, the access you have, what would you say happened to Alexei Navalny? Was he poisoned? What happened to him?
Well, I mean, I can only tell you what people are saying, having no medical training myself. I mean, the doctors that are treating him in Berlin, they say that he's been poisoned. And that was their initial analysis. They've yet to name the exact substance, but they've given the family it belongs to. Whereas the doctors that treated him in Omsk in Siberia, where he was originally hospitalized for the first 36 hours, they said that blood tests did not show such a substance. There's a long way to go here. We do know that Mr. Navalny, Alexei Navalny, is likely to survive, according to the German doctors. But this is going to take weeks and months until it all comes out what actually happened. I mean, obviously, when he recovers himself, he will have stuff to say. Will he go back to Russia? Will he stay in Germany? Will he go to some other country? Who knows? But at the moment, that's what we know.
Alexis, I'm just looking at a clip from RT. I'm going to share it with you. The title was Toxic Situation. Navalny tests negative for toxins while mainstream media peddles Kremlin involved. Let's have a look at that clip.
Now, let's not forget, just last year, another so-called suspected poisoning took place when Navalny was hospitalized for having a swollen face. He said he never had an allergic reaction before. He suggested perhaps he was poisoned, and his personal doctor said he could have been exposed to a toxic agent. Now, in the end, what did it turn out to be? Just an allergic reaction. But it seems like the Western media hasn't really learned from this story, because they're already jumping to conclusions about the Kremlin's alleged role in this whole situation.
Alexei, I'm just wondering that the view from inside Russia generally very different from the view outside of Russia. Does that matter to the way that we understand this story?
I think that Alexei Navalny is so high profile that it is unlikely for anyone to have used poison on him that isn't from the administration. I don't think any low-level bureaucrats or anything like that would have used poison. Nevertheless, what's important here is that poison is used as an intimidation tactic, and it's an effective intimidation tactic if it prevents others from getting involved in politics and protest politics and getting out into the street. I think that part of what makes poison more interesting, perhaps, or more common as a tool used by the Kremlin than just killing someone, for example, is its theatrical element. I think that poison is specifically a slow-moving thing, and like my colleague said, Brian said, it takes a long time for someone to recover, and it will take Navalny a long time to recover. And when he wakes up, it will be in the news cycle again. And so the poisoning continues to have a theatrical element, which just expands the intimidation factor.
What does Navalny's situation, Brian, tell us about Russian politics and where opposing voices fit in?
Can I just say first, just back on what Alexis was saying a second ago, that I take her point about the whole theatricality thing. I take her point because obviously if they wanted Navalny gone, they could find much faster ways and easier ways to do it. But I don't necessarily agree that this would have to come from the administration. If you're here in Russia itself, it's very hard to understand what value doing this to Alexei Navalny would have for the Kremlin itself, up at Putin's level. I mean, you're in a situation right now where, there's trouble in Belarus. There's been protests in Khabarovsk, a large city, the largest city in the far east of Russia. There is, the COVID emergency, for example. The last thing they really needed was protests on the street about Alexei Navalny right now. And I'm a little bit skeptical on that. Plus, as you said in your introduction, Alexei Navalny is arguably the most famous investigative journalist in Russia, as well as being a political figure, especially in Moscow. And, he's got, unfortunately, like many investigators, especially in a country like Russia, where the media is probably not as protected as it should be, he's got a lot of enemies. And, so I don't necessarily agree that this had to come from the administration. I'm willing to answer the question you asked now, which is I've just kind of forgotten my little ramble.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that.
Sorry.
What is it? No, it's all great information. It's why I wanted you to be on the stream today. Can we extrapolate from Navalny being in a hospital bed in Germany to opposing voices within Russia? Do those two things connect? Can you then just digress a bit more? Yeah, of course you can.
Yeah, but it's only a week ago, as Alexis knows, because she follows this so closely and it's her specialist subject. It's only a week ago since the American and British media were claiming that the Russian doctors were trying to stop him from being released to Germany, or the Kremlin was trying to stop him. It was actually last Friday week. So, I mean, it's mixed up a little bit, because like if they were trying to, hide what's going on, or prolong the agony, so to speak, why did they let him go to Germany so quickly? I mean, if they were trying to cover up for the presidential administration. So because obviously once he got on that German plane, which by the way was less than 48 hours after he took ill, it was he was handed over to the Germans, I think about 40 or 41 hours after it happened. They could immediately obviously do a blood test. That's just the point about the politics element of it. Of course, this will intimidate people that want to go into politics. But as a thing that Alexei is aware of is that there are different types of politics in Russia. For example, there's what they call systemic and non-systemic politics. So it's certainly not going to intimidate people that want to join United Russia or the Communist Party who are involved in the system itself. But it will certainly make people possibly, especially given what happened to Boris Nemtsov a few years ago, make people that want to join, say, the Western-leaning opposition nervous. There's no doubt about that.
All right, so I'm going to go to YouTube, Alexis, and you can help me out here. Andre E says, Navalny is not an opposition in Russia. He is a YouTube clown. That's referencing a lot of the work that he puts out on YouTube, okay? That made you smile. And Mia makes a really interesting point here. Let's forget about politics just for now. This man has a family and 2 kids. Imagine how they feel right now, which leads me to Alexis. Can you explain what it is that Navalny does within Russia, how he's known within Russia, and why perhaps he could be considered to be a threat?
Navalny he's a lawyer and a YouTube activist and a anti-corruption activist. He got his start, he came to power, I would say around 2011, 2012 on LiveJournal, by communicating to the sort of nationalists and far-right extremists in Russia about corruption. He has more recently connected with a younger demographic. He came out with a very strong anti-Medvedev sort of corruption expose in 2017, which I guess brought in a lot of money for his nonprofit. And so he is threatening because he has access to information and he is able to disseminate information in a country that censors the mainstream media, some of the mainstream media, not all of it, and not officially at any rate, but is less able to censor it on the web. And therefore, he's able to disseminate information that is private information in a way that accesses potential demonstrators that could be mobilized. So he has a lot of power in that he is threatening with his access to information.
Brian and Alexis, I want to play this to you. This is Sophia. Sophia is a senior program manager for Europe and Eurasia at Freedom House, and she told us this a little bit earlier. Have a listen.
The poisoning of Navalny and how the Russian government handled its aftermath only confirmed what everybody already knew, that Alexei Navalny is a major threat to Putin's regime. It's too soon to speculate about the consequences of this event for freedom in Russia more broadly, but right now the major threat is, of course, the Smart Vote campaign ahead of the multiple regional elections on September 13th. While Navalny is recovering, all his projects continue their work because they rely on established, robust management systems and volunteer networks, but it's clear that this brazen attempt on his life only further angers and motivates his supporters.
Interesting. Brian was doing this and Alexis was doing this. Let's start with Brian first of all. Go ahead.
No, I think the contribution there from Sophia was very naive, to be honest with you, and probably, I don't know if she's based in Russia, but doesn't reflect the reality on the ground here. The simple reality is that, look, the political system in Russia, what they're trying to do in Russia is, what they want above all is stability. This is what they're always talking about, stability. And Navalny played his role in a system of stability in the sense that, obviously the Kremlin is on top of the vertical, so to speak, but within the opposition, he was there, as Alexis has said, he's been around for about 10 years now. And, he's not any more popular now than he was 7 or 8 years ago. In fact, he's maybe even less popular than he was in 2013 when he gave a very respectable showing in the Moscow mayoral election. So he wasn't an electoral threat or a support threat to the Kremlin. And if it makes sense for the Kremlin to have taken him out, because by removing him from the scene, they actually bring instability into the system. Because obviously, if Navalny does not come back to Russia, somebody else is going to take his place in the non-systemic opposition. And that person may turn out to be way more charismatic and way more popular than Navalny and way more credible as a political figure. Because we look at Navalny's political platform as it was, it's almost the same as Putin's. I mean, it's neoliberal economics. It's he supported he wouldn't say supported, but he certainly has no intention of returning Crimea to Ukraine. He's been involved in nationalism in the past, which is kind of like what Putin does. If you got, for example, a younger guy, a more telegenic kind of guy than Navalny, for example, more charismatic, Navalny's a bit dour, and this guy, was maybe more left of center, like maybe AOC in the States, for example, or Jeremy Corbyn was in Britain. That's far more of a threat in my book than a guy who really, was
Brian,
seen more as a sort of...
People in the UK might be laughing at the idea of Jeremy Corbyn being charismatic, but
because Corbyn energized people in the UK. Now, he didn't energize enough of them, but he energized his core support, if you know what I mean. Momentum and all that.
All right, before I go back to Alexis, let's just play a little bit of Navalny here. And this was in August 2019 when he'd come out of prison. So there have been other times when he hasn't been present in Russian politics. This is what he said about a year ago. Have a listen.
Now we see that lies and fraud are not enough for them already. It's not enough for them to ban the candidates from the election. They deliberately want to arrest dozens, to beat up hundreds, to smash organizations of anti-corruption fund, and it shows that there is no support to them. They feel this and they are afraid.
Alexis, I'm also going to go via this tweet. Amicable International says on Twitter to us when we told them we were doing this show, is Russia a one-man show nation now? Because we're asking about opposition voices. Is there space for people to have a different opinion? Alexis?
What a great question. Thank you. Thank you for the person on Twitter who asked that. So Russia is a state that uses democratic institutions, elections, parties, the judiciary to fulfill authoritarian aims, which is why we call it a hybrid authoritarian state. And Brian is absolutely right when he talks about the systemic and non-systemic opposition. The systemic opposition is, just to give give the viewers a little more clarity, the systemic opposition is essentially either people running explicitly with Edina Erossia, the incumbent's political party, or people who you find they run for president and they have a full campaign and they're not explicitly critical, and in the end they end up voting for Putin. They say, oh, in the end I support the incumbent, which is funny when they can vote for themselves. Or you have people who are interested in single issue campaigns like pension reform, for example, or some kind of unemployment concern that they have. So the opposition, what we call the true opposition, is a very, very, very small percentage of the actual landscape of opposition politics in Russia. I would say 10, maybe 20%, very, very small. And for those opposition leaders running in any kind of election, they have all kinds of barriers to their success. They are going to run into repression, for example, exile or hear poisoning, maybe, or in other cases, jailing or killing or public beating. They have co-optation when they're bought off by the state and they no longer profess oppositional aims, or they could encounter some kind of quasi-legal barrier. For example, their signatures that they collect could be essentially deemed invalid or thrown out, and that could prevent them from running for any kind of race. Then those 1 or 2 people that actually make it to election day, they get 2-3% of the vote, if that. So there are substantial barriers to the opposition. This is why we call it, again, a hybrid authoritarian state, where opposition leaders can theoretically run for power, but they're not actually going to realistically get there.
I want to share a headline with you, guests, and also audience. This headline was sent to us by the Russian consulate in the United States when we asked if they would take part in the program. And this is the headline they sent us. Lavrov says Western allegations of no investigation of Alexei Navalny's incident untrue. So they said the minute they heard that maybe he had been poisoned, they had started a pre-investigation. So that is their contribution to our discussion right now. Let me go over to Sergei, who kind of brings us full circle. We asked at the top of the show, is Russian opposition finished? This is what Sergei told us earlier.
The poisoning of Alexei Navalny is going to have very unfortunate, I would say devastating impact on the Russian opposition. The Russian opposition is disunited. You have liberals, conservatives, the far left, the far right, libertarians, you name it. And they have not been able to come together and form a common platform in opposition to Putin. Instead, they devote their times to squabbling and name-calling. This is where Navalny played such an important role. He stood above it all. He had the charisma, the drive to take this project forward. With him now being incapacitated, temporarily we hope, but who really can tell, the future of the Russian opposition is going to be in jeopardy once again.
Brian, you go first.
It's a very smart analysis by Sergei Radchenko. He's a very good analyst, actually. I follow him on Twitter, so I know. You know, Sergei has a lot of good points there, and it's very difficult to disagree with a lot of what he said. However, I would just say one thing, that Sergei is right about this disparate opposition that are constantly fighting amongst themselves, but I think it's dangerous to completely discount the systemic opposition. I mean, in the sense that, you know, while the leadership of both parties, the LDPR, which is basically a far-right ultranationalist party, and the Communist Party, which does what it says in the tin, basically, you know, the leadership of those parties is you know, easily placated and rarely rocks the boat. Although it is worth noting the communists very vehemently opposed the recent constitution referendum that Putin put through. But at a local level, certainly around the country, as we just saw in Khabarovsk with Sergei Furgal, they can quite often be a real opposition, these parties, certainly at local level around the country, in the provinces. And I think when you say, you know, like what Alexei just said about the real opposition, or what people abroad call the real opposition, you've got to be a little bit careful with that. You can't actually completely discount the systemic parties. I mean, in the sense that, you know, in the future stage, under different leadership, they might become totally different entities. And the fact is that they are the only parties, national network on a scale that they could maybe manage some kind of power transition in the future if it ever happens.
Okay. Alexis, go ahead.
I agree with that. I think that you can't discount all systemic opposition candidates. I think some of them have actual platforms. Like I said, some of them are single issue candidates, and they do have some benefit of cooperating with the incumbent and getting their issue on some kind of agenda. However, generally they're not the same as your democratic revolution sort of opposition candidate. So you asked a question. I think Dr. Radchenko had an interesting point, but I think he said something that the opposition, the future is dead, and I wanted to respond to that. I believe that he's right, that there are many supporters that really believe in Navalny and Navalny's agenda. I think that there are many that come to his protests that do not occur during election cycles. There are people who adore him. However, I think the majority of people coming out into the streets to support Russian pluralism are the people who are concerned about the administration's handling of COVID-19. They're people who are concerned with putting food on the table, with unemployment, with loss of their own job, and security for that of themselves and their families. So do I think the future of Russian opposition is dead? Not at all. I agree actually with something Brian said earlier, which is that someone else will come up and they will be equally popular. Certainly.
Alexis and Brian, this is going to be the speed round. YouTubers are talking to you. You're going to react very quickly, and then we're going to move on. James Farella, the old saying, you can kill a man, but not an idea. I think most Russians now see Putin for what he is. I think opposition will now get stronger. Brian.
He may be right. Who knows? We'll see what happens in the future. But it's very hard. Again, the question is, what is the issue? They're disunited, as Dr. Radchenko said, and it might make one part of the opposition stronger, perhaps the Moscow protest movement. But where I live, which is not Moscow, I'm 1,500 kilometers to the south. Nobody's talking about Navalny at all. Nobody. Even my liberal friends are not talking about it. Not interested, basically.
Joseph is on YouTube. Thank you, Joseph, for weighing in. Russia has no opposition. President Putin is all in charge and in charge of the opposition. Alexis, you take that one.
I think that what we need to think about is that Putin is not only using repression. There are a slew of other options available to the incumbent of the Russian Federation. He can also use, for example, co-optation. And this is something that we see on YouTube, in rap videos, in graffiti that's all over Moscow and all over cities across Russia. The state is able to co-opt these avenues of communication and repurpose them for state aims, policies, narratives, and in turn flooding out these spaces where people used to communicate freely about politics and pushing those critical voices out of those public spaces, or at least to the margins of those public spaces.
I noticed, and I'm just looking and checking to see what YouTube is talking about on today's show, and a lot is about the constitutional vote that lets Putin stay in power till 2036. That is causing a lot of conversation. Brian, are your liberal friends talking about that?
Yes, they were talking about that, and a lot of them are very harmed by it, and a lot of them voted against it for that reason. And some of my friends that are not liberal, who lean towards communist nationalism, voted against it, not happy with it. But look at that. The Constitution allows President to stay in power until 2036, but I think it's very unlikely he would stay in power until 2036. Most serious experts here in Russia believe it was more to avoid becoming a lame duck and reserving the option of coming back in the future should his successor, make a mess of it. I would be inclined toward that belief. I think running a country like Russia, plus there's a comment that Putin made in January. He commented about all these guys like Brezhnev and Andropov and Chernenko back in the 80s that died in office and said he didn't want that to happen again. Now, if he's going to hang on until his early 80s, there's a very good chance of that happening.
Ryan, I'm going to leave that as your last sentence. Alexis, can you wrap us up in a single sentence? Is the Russian opposition finished? And your concluding thought would be what?
Certainly, I don't believe that the Russian opposition is finished. I think that Navalny is important to many people, but not to everyone, and that people will come out into the streets when their security and their stability is threatened.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, YouTubers, for your excellent questions. I will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.